At a family dinner, my guardians casually mentioned that my cousin would be moving in with me. I just let them talk. They had no idea I had already moved to a new condo they knew nothing about. I, 26M, sat at the mahogany dining table, fork halfway to my mouth, when my aunt dropped the bombshell like she was discussing the weather. She mentioned that my cousin would be moving in with me next month, and my uncle nodded along as if this was already settled. They spoke about how convenient it would be, how my cousin needed a fresh start after his latest job fell through, and how family should always help family. I kept chewing my roast beef, letting them paint their perfect picture of my future living arrangement. What they didn't know was that 3 weeks ago, I had signed a lease on a luxury condo across town. The keys were already burning a hole in my pocket. My guardians had raised me since I was 12, after my parents died in a car accident. For 14 years, I had been grateful, compliant, and accommodating. I had lived in their basement apartment, paying rent that was supposedly going toward my future while they made decisions about my life without consulting me. This dinner was just another example of their assumption that I would always be their controllable ward. My aunt continued explaining how my cousin had been struggling financially and how this arrangement would benefit everyone. She mentioned that he could help with household chores and that I wouldn't feel so lonely in that big house. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were talking about the house I had already vacated. I had spent months planning this move. The new condo was a 2-bedroom unit on the 15th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I had furnished it completely, transferred my utilities, and even changed my mailing address. My guardians had no idea because I had been strategic about timing my absences and maintaining the illusion that I still lived in their basement. My uncle asked if I was excited about having company, and I simply nodded, taking another bite of dinner. I told them it sounded like an interesting arrangement. Inside, I was calculating how long it would take them to realize I was gone. The conversation shifted to logistics. My aunt mentioned that my cousin would arrive on the 15th of next month with all his belongings. She had already promised him the spare bedroom and assured him that I was easygoing and wouldn't mind the company. My uncle added that this would be good for both of us, especially since my cousin was going through a rough patch with his ex-girlfriend. I asked a few polite questions about timing and what my cousin might need, playing the role of the accommodating family member they expected me to be. All the while, I was thinking about my new home office, where I had already set up my computer and started working remotely. My employer had approved the arrangement, and I was more productive than I had been in years. After dinner, I helped clear the dishes and listened to more details about the arrangement. My aunt mentioned that she had already told my cousin he could move in, and they had discussed splitting utilities and groceries. She seemed pleased with herself for orchestrating what she believed was a perfect solution for everyone involved. I thanked them for dinner and mentioned that I had some work to catch up on. As I walked toward the basement door, my uncle reminded me to start clearing out some space for my cousin's things. I assured him I would take care of everything. Back in the basement, I looked around at the space that had been my home for so long. I had already removed everything important, leaving only the furniture that came with the room and some old clothes I no longer wanted. The walls looked bare without my personal items, but my guardians hadn't noticed because they rarely came downstairs. Over the next few days, I maintained my normal routine while secretly enjoying the knowledge of what was coming. I would leave the house each morning, ostensibly for work, but actually to go to my new condo. I spent my days there, working and settling in, then returned to the basement each evening for dinner and to keep up appearances. My aunt called twice to discuss more details about my cousin's arrival. She wanted to make sure I understood that this was a long-term arrangement, not just a temporary stay. She mentioned that my cousin was looking for work in the area and might need several months to get back on his feet. I listened patiently and agreed to whatever she suggested. The weekend before my cousin's planned arrival, I made my final preparations. I cleaned out the last of my belongings from the basement, leaving only the basics. I also left a note on the kitchen counter, sealed in an envelope with my aunt's name on it. On moving day, I woke up early and left the house before anyone else was awake. I drove to my condo and settled in to wait. I had taken the day off work, knowing that this would be when everything unfolded. Update 1. Around noon, my phone started ringing. My aunt's name appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. She called 3 more times in the next hour. I could imagine the scene at the house. My cousin arriving with his belongings, my guardians going to the basement to introduce him to his new living situation, and finding the space empty except for basic furniture in my note. The note was simple and direct. I had written that I appreciated everything they had done for me over the years, but I had moved out and would no longer be living in their basement. I mentioned that I was an adult who was capable of making my own housing decisions, and I hoped they would understand that I needed independence. By evening, I had received 12 missed calls and several text messages. My uncle had also started calling, and I could tell from the frequency that they were becoming increasingly frustrated. The messages ranged from confused to angry, with my aunt demanding to know where I was and why I hadn't discussed this with them. I finally answered the phone around 8 o'clock. My aunt immediately launched into a tirade about how irresponsible and selfish I was being. She mentioned that my cousin was standing in their living room with all his belongings, having nowhere to go because I had disappeared without warning. She demanded to know where I was living and insisted that I come back immediately to sort out this mess. I calmly explained that I was living in my own place and that I was not responsible for housing arrangements I had never agreed to. I reminded her that no one had asked me if I wanted a roommate before making promises to my cousin. My aunt argued that family obligations superseded my personal preferences and that I was being ungrateful after everything they had done for me. The conversation became heated when I pointed out that I had been paying rent for their basement while they made decisions about my life without consulting me. I mentioned that I was 26 years old and capable of choosing my own living situation. My aunt accused me of being vindictive and planning this whole thing to embarrass them in front of my cousin. She wasn't wrong about the planning part, but I corrected her about the motivation. I explained that this wasn't about embarrassment. It was about establishing boundaries and taking control of my own life. I had simply chosen not to participate in an arrangement that I had never agreed to. My uncle got on the phone and tried a different approach. He appealed to my sense of family loyalty and reminded me of all the sacrifices they had made to raise me. He mentioned that my cousin was in a difficult situation and really needed help, and that I was the only family member in a position to provide it. I acknowledged their sacrifices and expressed genuine gratitude for everything they had done. However, I also pointed out that gratitude didn't mean I had to surrender my autonomy as an adult. I suggested that if they were concerned about my cousin's housing situation, they could help him find other arrangements or let him stay with them temporarily. Update 2. The next few days were tense. My guardians alternated between anger and guilt trips, trying various strategies to get me to reveal my location and return to their basement. My cousin even called directly, explaining his situation and asking if we could work something out. I felt bad for him because he was caught in the middle of a situation he hadn't created, but I also knew that giving in would set a precedent for future decisions being made without my input. I offered to help my cousin find other housing options and even suggested some resources for temporary accommodation. I made it clear that my issue wasn't with him personally, but with the way the arrangement had been handled. He seemed to understand, though he was obviously disappointed and stressed about his housing situation. My aunt tried a different tactic, showing up at my workplace to confront me. She had somehow found out where I worked and appeared in the lobby, demanding to speak with me. Security had to escort her out when she became disruptive, insisting that I was being manipulated by someone and that I needed to come home immediately. This incident made me realize how little my guardians actually knew about my adult life. They had assumed I would always be available for their decisions because I had been compliant for so long. They had no idea about my financial situation, my career progress, or my personal goals because they had never asked. I decided it was time to have a more comprehensive conversation. I invited them to meet me at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. I chose a public place because I wanted to avoid the emotional manipulation that often happened in private family discussions. The meeting was awkward from the start. My aunt immediately demanded to know where I was living and how I could afford it. She seemed convinced that I was either lying about my financial situation or had gotten involved in something questionable. My uncle was more subdued but clearly disappointed in what he saw as my betrayal of family values. I explained my living situation honestly. I had been saving money for years, working overtime, and building my career while living in their basement. I had been planning this move for months, not as an act of rebellion, but as a natural step toward independence. The timing had coincided with their announcement about my cousin, but the decision to move had been made long before that dinner conversation. My aunt struggled to accept that I had been capable of planning and executing such a significant life change without their knowledge or approval. She kept asking why I hadn't discussed it with them, and I had to explain repeatedly that I was an adult who didn't need permission to make housing decisions. The conversation revealed deeper issues about control and expectations. My guardians had become accustomed to having input on all aspects of my life, and they saw my independence as a rejection of their authority and care. I tried to help them understand that independence was actually a sign that they had succeeded in raising me to be self-sufficient. Update 3. Over the following weeks, the family dynamics slowly began to shift. My cousin found temporary housing with a friend and eventually secured a small apartment across town. He thanked me for the housing resources I had provided and seemed to understand my position better than my guardians did. My aunt and uncle went through what I can only describe as a grieving process. They had to adjust their expectations about their role in my life and accept that I was no longer the dependent ward they had been caring for. This was difficult for them because their identity as my guardians had become central to how they saw themselves. I made efforts to maintain the relationship while establishing clear boundaries. I continued to visit for family dinners, but I made it clear that major decisions about my life would be made by me. I also started sharing more about my work and personal goals, helping them understand who I had become as an adult. The most significant change was in how they communicated with me. Instead of making announcements about what I would be doing, they started asking questions and seeking my input. It was a small but important shift that showed they were beginning to see me as an independent adult rather than someone whose life they could manage. My cousin and I actually developed a better relationship through this experience. He appreciated that I had helped him find resources and hadn't made the situation personal. We started meeting for coffee occasionally, and he mentioned that watching me establish boundaries had inspired him to be more assertive in his own family relationships. The condo became everything I had hoped it would be. I loved waking up to the city view and having complete control over my living space. I was more productive at work, had more energy for personal projects, and felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. The independence I had gained was worth every uncomfortable conversation and strained family dinner. Looking back, I realized that the dinner conversation had been a catalyst rather than the cause of my decision to move. I had been ready for independence for a long time, but I had been avoiding the difficult conversations that would be necessary to establish it. My guardian's assumption that they could make housing decisions for me had simply forced the issue to a head. The experience taught me valuable lessons about communication, boundaries, and family dynamics. I learned that sometimes you have to make unilateral decisions to protect your autonomy, even when it creates temporary conflict. I also learned that people who care about you can adapt to new boundaries if you're patient and consistent in maintaining them. My guardians eventually admitted that they were proud of my independence, even though the way I had achieved it had been difficult for them to accept. They recognized that their approach had been controlling and that they needed to adjust their expectations about their role in my adult life. The revenge aspect of my plan had been satisfying in the moment, but the long-term benefits of establishing independence were much more valuable. I had proven to myself and to my family that I was capable of making major life decisions and following through on them. The confidence I gained from this experience affected every other area of my life. 6 months later, family dinners had returned to normal, but with a new dynamic. My guardians asked about my life instead of making assumptions about it. They respected my decisions even when they didn't fully understand them. And most importantly, they had learned that their role in my life had evolved from guardians to supportive family members. The empty basement apartment served as a daily reminder to them that I was no longer the dependent child they had been caring for. Eventually, they converted it into a home office, symbolically acknowledging that chapter of our relationship had ended and a new one had begun.